Income Tax 2020 Method of Learning Tax Law. Come in and relax with Income Tax 2020. Tax law can be overwhelming. There's a lot of information within tax law, and it's the type of information that can be quite intimidating. Therefore, we need a systematic approach in order to learn tax law. A systematic approach can help us to learn the tax law, and it can also help us to basically practice tax law so that we can see the tax from different angles. When we actually prepare a tax return, it's nice to be able to see it from different angles. That gives us another internal control, another check to make sure that everything is going as it should. We will be taking a look at the tax law from three major approaches or three major angles as we think about practice tax returns and so on. One will be a formula basis, meaning we're going to take the information from the tax returns, from the instructions, from the tax law, break it out into a basic tax formula, one that we can see outside of a tax return. It will be easier to see that way because you don't have all the boxes saying add box 1 plus box 2, a very long tax return, which can be long given all that information and the way it's going to be put together in a tax return, which is nice for a systematic approach, but it's easier to see if you pull it out in terms of a formula. A formula also allows us to intuit it more easily, to be able to understand how the formula works and therefore be able to understand what different changes will be impacting the formula in what ways. So that helps with tax projections because we can start to say, okay, I see the formula in my mind, and that's a lot easier to do than an actual tax return. And now if something happens, if you have a change or if I'm projecting into the future, then I can have a better understanding intuitively of what will happen if I have the formula down. We'll also take a look at the tax forms. Now, the tax forms you can get on the IRS website at irs.gov. You can also get the instructions there. We'll also be using tax software to both look at the data input of the software, but also the forms will be generated in the software as well. And then we will take a look at software. Now, if you do not have access to tax software, that's okay, because it's just you would just want to know that software is a really useful tool. So if you go into a tax practice, then of course the software is useful because you need to both understand the tax return and understand the software to some degree, because the taxes have gotten to a level of complexity that you want the software to aid you inputting the information into the software. In other words, in tax practice, typically we'll enter the information into the tax software, the software will help us to generate the returns. Then we want to review the forms and make sure that the reforms look proper to us. And then we also I would suggest doing it with a formula basis as well, like separately, just so you understand it intuitively. That can help you to pick up any problems or anything that could still be picked up on the tax return and give you that double check, that internal control that the tax returns have been completed properly. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on these methods here, and then we'll go into more detail about them later on. And when we work practice problems, we'll actually look at these methods when we work the practice problem. But here's the basic tax formula. So the tax formula, you'll recall, you should know it's going to be an income statement. So on the individual tax return, we're talking about individual taxes right now, then we don't typically have a balance sheet. We're not looking at the balance sheet where people stand at some point in time. In other words, assets and liabilities, no assets and liabilities. We're typically looking at the income statement, which is the timing statement, the performance statement. So we have income, and then we're going to have adjustments to income, which used to be called above the line deductions, now possibly Schedule 1 type of deductions. That gives us to our adjusted gross income minus the greater of either the standard deduction or the itemized deduction. That gets us to the taxable income. So this part up top is basically kind of like an income statement on a tax basis. Then down here, it gets a little bit more confusing in some ways, because now we're deviating from a standard financial type income statement, and we're talking about things like credits and payments. So once you get to the taxable income, then we have to calculate the tax on it. We have to use tax tables to do that because we have a progressive tax system. That'll give us the tax before credits and other taxes, and then we're going to add and subtract tax and credits. Credits and other taxes like self-employment tax and AMT tax, if applicable. That'll give us finally the total tax, and then we'll subtract out the payments that have already been made. So that'll give us, this will basically be the amount that would be owed, except for the fact that we had payments. Then we'll subtract out the payments, and if there are any refundable credits, we'll also have them down here below, and we'll talk about what a refundable credit is and what a non-refundable credit is in future presentations. And finally, we get to the tax refund or tax due at the end of the day. Now, this calculation in practice and when we work practice problems, we'll basically do in Excel. So if I was to work in practice, I would enter the information basically into the tax software, check the forms, and then possibly work it again in a formula basis in Excel, which will look something like this. And this is useful in practice. It's also useful to learn the information because you can structure our worksheet kind of like a tax return would be, but something that's probably more intuitive to most people. In other words, we will have our major line items for our income tax formula here. We can then support those line items with a whole separate worksheet. So this is going to be like the summary sheet. You can think of the tax formula as the summary sheet. And then if I want to get more detail on the income line item, then I can jump over here to the income worksheet, which is going to be all the items that are adding up, or some of the items in any case, that are going to be added up to take care of that first line item on the income statement. The adjustments to income, same thing, will be on a separate worksheet. And that's kind of how the tax return is set up for the most part as well. So we'll see that more as we work through practice problems. So that's going to be the worksheet that we can think about in Excel. Obviously, the forms then are going to be the actual tax forms. That's going to be the 1040. And well, the 1040 being the major form, the like display form, and then you got the supporting documentations or the supporting forms, kind of like the supporting schedules or worksheets that we saw on the Excel sheet. Here's an example of a 1040. Now this is in tax software, but you can also find it just on the IRS website. You can just download a 1040 on the IRS website as a PDF file, and you can practice just entering it there as if you so choose, and you have the instructions for the 1040 as well. In practice, most people do not start by entering the information directly into the 1040 using the instructions, but rather use the tax software, and then with their intuitive understanding of the 1040, having working with them a few times, they would then go into the 1040 and basically double check the line items. You can see how this kind of lines up to our formula up top. We have the income up top, all the stuff up top in page 1 is basically going to be the income, which kind of lines up to the first item of our formula here. Then on schedule 1, we're going to have our additions to this is other income, and then our adjustments to income in part 2 of schedule 1. So that's going to be the adjustments to income. That gets us to our adjusted gross income. The adjusted gross income on the tax return, line 10. And then we have the taxable income. Then we have the standard deduction or the itemized deduction, line 12. That gets us to the taxable income. So that's basically our income statement side of things, gets us to the taxable income. Then we calculate the tax on that. And that's going to be the calculation of the tax. And then we have the amounts from schedule 2, line 3. This is schedule 2. Line 3 would be additional tax. So we'd have the alternative minimum tax, for example, if that was applicable. So back on over to the return. And then we have credits, so child tax credit. And then you're going to add those up, add lines 19 and 20, subtract line 21 from 18. And then we have other taxes, including self-employment tax would be included here. So that would be if you have a Schedule C. That then gets you to your total tax, which matches our formula down here on the total tax. And then you get to your payments that you have, your withholdings on the W-2 and so forth. And then the refundable credits again, which we'll talk about later, which finally is going to get you down to the bottom line, which will be the amount refunded or tax due at that point in time. So again, if you're in practice or even if you're just doing your tax return, you probably don't want to do just entering the data directly into the form, but it's really good practice to do that. So when you're practicing, you'd like to do that a few different times, read the instructions and actually go through this thing line by line. And then once you have an intuitive understanding, you can kind of work through the tax return, then use the tax software, and that'll really help you if you're in a practice to do that. Next, we have tax software. Now, tax software can be a little bit confusing because there's a whole lot of different options that you can choose from with relation to the tax software. But you can basically break out the tax software into 2 general categories. One's going to be the professional tax software, and the other is going to be tax software that's geared towards individual tax preparation. So, for example, Lacerte, which is a tax software that's owned by Intuit, that's an owner of QuickBooks as well. And Intuit also owns TurboTax, but Lacerte is going to be a professional software that usually CPA firms would then be using, and TurboTax, also owned by Intuit, is marketed towards individuals And that's going to be software that's, it'll both do the tax return, of course, but the approach of doing the tax returns will be a little bit different. They're both good tools to be using. You might use an H&R Block type of software or other, any type of tax software is useful to do the data input. There's even free tax software capabilities to some degree on the IRS website, and they have a good tax estimator as well, which basically works kind of like a projection tool, which is similar to a tax software as well. So you can use that tool depending on what your purposes are. If you're just kind of practicing the data input, that can be useful. One of the major differences between these two categories of tax returns are that the professional tax software is going to be geared more towards just entering the data as quickly into the fields, directly into the tax software fields, whereas the software that's geared towards individuals is going to be more of an interview type of basis software. So in other words, if you were to go to like a Lacerte, this is Lacerte software, which would be like a software geared towards like a CPA firm or something like that, then you're going to go directly into data input fields here. So you're going to enter the data, directly into a data input field. W-2s will just go right there and enter the W-2s. If it was a TurboTax type software, an H&R Block type software, some software geared towards an individual, then you're more likely to have an interview type process. It's basically going to say, it's going to walk you through a questionnaire and you'll be answering the questionnaire. That can be very useful to walk through the questionnaire, but it can be kind of burdensome if you're doing a lot of returns and you have to keep on going back to like an interview process to see where the data input will go. But both softwares are really good, useful tools to practice with.